The first shard punched through the plating with the sound of breaking glass and shattering arrogance. A noise Aurek realized he'd been waiting for since the day he first smelled the metallic tang of synthesized decay on Station 4 Lambda. He slammed his gloved palm onto the emergency sealant interface. The pressure gauge spun backward, dropping from standard atmospheric density towards the red danger zone, 90 seconds from catastrophic rupture. Volatile preservative gas, a neurotoxin mixed with high-concentration molecular solvent, was already leaking, condensing into sickly blue mist that clung to the cold titanium floor. Aurek ignored the persistent shrieking siren, focusing instead on the geometry of the failure. It wasn't a structural fatigue issue. The breach was caused by the material inside trying to get out, a fragment of alien bone that wasn't bone at all, acting like a runaway projectile, driven by the violent kinetic energy of the containment system's internal collapse. The primary molecular solvent reservoir was already signaling low. He needed to stabilize the breach before the remaining volatile compound vaporized, drowning both the unarmored specimen and him. Aurek, the thanatologist, the man who categorized death, moved with the unnatural precision of someone trained not in maintenance but in triage under fire. His civilian contract ID and grey laboratory jumpsuit meant nothing now. He was fixing a problem that human material science swore was impossible. He pulled the portable high-pressure injector kit from the magnetic rack. His fingers, thin and scarred by years of handling cold fragments of the dead, found the access port by instinct. The ozone was thick now, burning the back of his throat, reminding him of the Demetra Prime battlefields, 3 light-years away, where 500,000 Terran Marines learned the terrible truth about their steel. The Marines had laughed. Aurek remembered reading in the debrief logs. They had laughed at the enemy's lack of armor. And then their own standard kinetic rounds had fragmented uselessly against what they believed were simply indigenous life forms clad in thick skin. Aurek injected the repair polymer, a temporary sealant, directly into the microscopic opening around the invading shard. He watched the polymer flow, anticipating the crystal structure of the alien material. Standard repair compounds relied on bonding with the calcium-based structure of organic contaminants. But this wasn't calcium. This segment, a partial ribcage Aurek designated Specimen Kilo 7, was a miracle and a nightmare grown real. It was a dense, biologically induced silicon carbide lattice. It wasn't just superior material. It was structure defying the fundamental limits Terran biologists placed on organic life. It was armor grown from the inside out, engineered by 1 billion years of hostile evolution. This was the physics of failure, his specialty. Not if systems failed, but how they failed when confronted by physical laws they did not account for. The Terran military had designed kinetic armor based on known material science. The unarmored evolved a structural matrix that simply ignored those assumptions. It made the Marines' laughter a sick joke, played by the universe itself. The emergency polymer pulsed around the fragment, but it did not adhere. The pressure drop slowed, but did not stop. The lattice structure of the shard rejected the sealant, treating the polymer molecules as impurities, pushing them away with a low infrasound hum that vibrated the metal decking beneath Aurek's thin boots. He had known this would happen. He was the one who wrote the report detailing why standard field repairs were futile against the unarmored. He pulled back the standard injector. He needed the experimental solvent, the last remaining vial of the molecular dissolver, designed not to bond, but to momentarily destabilize the crystal structure, creating micro fissures just large enough for a permanent seal patch. He located the vial, encased in heavy lead shielding, on the shelf above the console. As his hand reached for it, the tremor started, not from the failing containment field, but in his own hand. He saw the blueprint in his mind, superimposed over the failing gauge, the schematic for the sonic disruptor. His schematic. He had intended it as a surgical tool, a precise frequency emitter that could resonate the silicon carbide lattice into harmless dust, dismantling it at the molecular level, structure by structure. A scalpel to perform a precise structural autopsy. But Mars Command had intercepted the data streams. They didn't want a scalpel for understanding. They wanted a weapon for mass consumption. They wanted him to provide the final, complete, living tissue sample of the unarmored so they could field test the weaponized version of his disruptor. They wanted a bomb. If he used the specialized solvent now, he would save the sample, ensuring Command got their material for weaponization. If he failed, the sample would be destroyed, and with it perhaps the only immediate hope of turning the tide of the war, condemnation or genocide. The weight of millions of human lives against the profound moral horror of unleashing a bioweapon that could provoke an unpredictable evolutionary response in a species whose very existence already defied known physics. The pressure drop accelerated, jerking him violently back to the present. The blue mist thickened, burning his eyes through the protective visor. He grasped the vial. The lead shielding was cold, heavy. Choose. He fumbled the security release. The vial slipped, clattering against the deck plate, but did not break. A catastrophic error, a momentary paralysis born of the gut-deep knowledge that success meant complicity. Auric crouched, retrieving the precious, finite resource. You are classifying failure, Auric. Start with your own. He pressed the vial into the dedicated port. Time had shrunk to a dozen breaths. Override primary thermal cycling, he muttered, his voice raspy from the metallic air. He didn't wait for the system confirmation. Injecting targeted molecular destabilizer. The specialized solvent was slow-acting, designed for precision, not speed. He watched the alien shard. The silicon carbide was a deep, charcoal black, hard enough to slice armor, yet biologically grown. It looked dead, ancient, but was currently resisting all his efforts with passive, silent aggression. The chemical reaction began. Instead of dissolving, the surface of the shard began to shimmer, vibrating at a frequency just below the human threshold of hearing. A sound only the instruments registered, but which Auric felt as a low, persistent pressure in his inner ear. This was the resonant frequency. This was the point of structural failure. He pressed the seal patch into the now weakened area. The patch held. The pressure stabilized, barely. Auric leaned back against the containment chamber wall, breathing heavily, the smell of ozone and synthetic preservative clinging to his jumpsuit like stale sweat. He had bought himself time. The sample was preserved. The breach was contained. He looked at the fragment of bone, still embedded like a dark, crystalline thorn in the titanium plate. He had saved the sample, delivering it one step closer to Mars's weaponized agenda. The weight of that specific silicon carbide lattice felt like a stone in his stomach. The unarmored hadn't chosen war. They had simply been discovered possessing the superior material science. Terran arrogance, coupled with biological hubris, had turned a first contact into a massacre. Auric pushed himself off the wall and walked to his terminal. The station was quiet again, the vast, cold silence of deep space pressing in on the thin metal shell of 4 Lambda. He keyed in his access codes. The main screen glowed, displaying the current mission parameters received 3 cycles ago from Mars Command. The final line pulsed in sharp red lettering, awaiting confirmation of Specimen Kilo 7 viability. Authorization for Sonic Disruptor full-scale testing requires immediate submission of Resonant Frequency Blueprint, Protocol Omega. Auric knew he was alone. There were no witnesses in this sterile, decommissioned tomb. He could scrub the data. He could delete the blueprints, destroy the remaining solvent, and claim the sample was rendered useless by the breach. But he looked again at the pressure gauge, thinking of the 500,000 ghosts on Demetra Prime, the faces of soldiers whose only crime was believing their own armor could protect them. He moved the cursor. He hovered over the prompt to upload Protocol Omega. It wasn't just a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between a moral certainty that meant extinction and a potential evil that might just buy his species a future. He closed his eyes, tasting the metallic decay of the air. He felt the cold truth of the silicon carbide lattice in his bones. The structure he studied wasn't merely armor. It was a verdict delivered by reality itself. And the truth of that verdict was a secret far too dangerous to keep. His fingers trembled over the input key, hesitating over the trigger for the largest bomb in human history, disguised as a rescue plan. Auric's finger pulled back from the interface like a muscle spasm. He did not hit the upload key. Instead, he forced a series of 3 rapid inputs, masking the delay under a false system flag. Kilo 7 structural variants registered. Initiating 48-hour stability assessment. Upload delayed pending localized environmental normalization. It was a bold lie, a defiance hidden behind the jargon of his professional expertise. For one perfect silent second, the immense weight lifted. Then the consequence settled, heavier and sharper than the ozone still stinging his nostrils. He had not resolved the dilemma. He had simply postponed the moment of reckoning, condemning more Marines to the kinetic shredders of Demetra Prime in the interim. The metallic tang in the air shifted, tasting less like decay and more like the stale copper taste of his own failure. He needed to prove, definitively and immediately, why Protocol Omega was an evolutionary trigger, not a weapon. He had to make Mars Command see the bomb hidden in the scalpel. He moved to the analysis console, preparing the high-frequency diagnostic sequence. This was the true test, running a focused energy beam against the silicon carbide shard to observe its stress response beyond the limits of Terran physics models. He needed to find the inherent flaw in the unarmored's design, the resonant feedback loop that would turn the sonic disruptor into an uncontrollable systemic collapse. He typed the calibration coordinates. The screen flashed access denied. Auric frowned, assuming a local firewall. He tried the override sequence, inputting his thanatologist classification credentials, which should grant him level 9 clearance on this decommissioned hub. Access denied. Mars Command Directive 4, Lambda 77C. A high-pitched, almost imperceptible whine emanated from the console's casing, a sound of heavy machinery being locked down remotely. Aurek placed a palm on the titanium shell. It was hot, vibrating faintly, confirming the system was already being hijacked by external, distant forces. They weren't just waiting for the data. They were actively protecting the sample from any further investigation he might attempt. They wanted the weapon, not the understanding. He straightened, running a thin, scarred hand over his short, greying hair. The metallic air suddenly brought back a sharper, more visceral memory. It wasn't the ozone of 4 Lambda. It was the intense, coppery reek of a pressurized hull breach 6 years prior, during the disastrous Arctus campaign. His preliminary structural report on the new deployment vehicles had been buried under expediency waivers. He had told them the plating could not handle high-velocity shrapnel dispersal. They had laughed then, too. He saw the face of Elias in the blue mist, his junior analyst, trapped in the wreckage because Aurek hadn't fought hard enough to stop the deployment. You failed to classify the failure of the system, Aurek. You classified the dead. Elias's death wasn't a military statistic. It was the reason Aurek lived in the cold, ethical purgatory of 4 Lambda, cataloguing material science that killed humans. That old, burning guilt now fueled his resistance against Protocol Omega. He wouldn't let his research be weaponized into the next Arctus. A soft chime interrupted the silence. A secured transmission alert, Priority 1, received via encrypted burst from the Sol system. Mars Command. A synthetic male voice, smooth and utterly devoid of local reverberation, cut through the quiet of the lab. Thanatologist Aurek. Director Valerius speaking. We received your stability assessment notification. Valerius. The name was synonymous with ruthless logistical optimization. A man who saw soldiers as units of kinetic output and resources as vectors of victory. He was the antithesis of Aurek's meticulous, life-reverent science. The required data transfer, Protocol Omega, was scheduled for immediate submission. Your 48-hour delay is unacceptable. We are aware of your moral proclivities, Doctor. They are inefficient. Aurek moved closer to the microphone, his voice careful, low. Director, the sample integrity is paramount. The specific resonant frequency required for the disruptor is dangerously volatile. We need to assess the full systemic feedback loop before weaponization begins. Otherwise, we risk... Valerius cut him off with chilling efficiency. We risk defeat. The first prototype disruptor array is already en route to the Demetra Theatre. Estimated time to deployment, 48 hours, 5 minutes. We require the frequency signature before then. Do not mistake our patience for uncertainty, Doctor. We are moving forward. Aurek felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Forward? Without full-scale testing on Kilo 7. We have sufficient residual tissue samples from the Demetra cleanup. Fragment Gamma-3 provides 92% of the necessary structural data for calibration. Kilo 7 was merely for optimization. Valerius paused, the artificial silence heavy with threat. You have bought 48 hours of review time, Doctor. That is precisely when the device will be deployed. Upload the blueprint, or we will assume failure to comply and execute the deployment sequence using Fragment Gamma-3's data. Either way, the weapon fires. The call ended. The console hummed with the remote system lock. Aurek stood frozen, the metallic decay suddenly overwhelming. Valerius hadn't needed Kilo 7 for validation. He had needed it for perfection. And now Orek realized the terrible scope of his failure. By delaying the upload, he had forced Mars to rely on less accurate, potentially flawed data from Fragment Gamma 3. The weapon would launch regardless, but now it would be a prototype built on dangerous imprecision. A weapon exponentially more likely to fail catastrophically, or worse, provoke an unforeseen biological counter-reaction. He had tried to save millions by stopping a bomb, and instead he had just accelerated the launch of a highly unstable projectile. Orek moved rapidly, shedding his grey jumpsuit. He pulled on his flight coveralls, dark blue standard issue for transport personnel. A deliberate change of identity. He could no longer reason with Valerius, nor could he stop the deployment sequence remotely. His only option was to destroy the critical data source that Valerius claimed provided 92% of the weapon's necessary structural input, Fragment Gamma 3. But Gamma 3 was not on 4 Lambda. It was located on the Deep Space Staging Platform, Rivet Station Delta, 3 sectors away. Getting there meant activating the decommissioned transport drone, the Thanatographer, a violation of 3 separate Colonial Guard quarantines. It meant becoming a fugitive. He pulled a small shielded drive from his secure locker. His life's work, the original, precise, non-weaponized blueprints for the surgical disruptor. He strapped it to his thigh. He would take the solution with him, but he would not give them the weapon. Orek bypassed the local lockdown by cutting power to the primary terminal bank, sacrificing the last of his communications array. The silence that followed was absolute, cold, and welcome. He ran towards the maintenance bay, the soles of his boots slapping loudly against the metal decking. The Thanatographer was dark, covered in years of cosmic dust. As he threw the manual release lever, activating the emergency power, the primary warning sensor network, the system Valerius thought he had locked down, flickered back to life, running on the old, unpatched local network. Orek froze. The secondary screen, displaying external kinematic activity, lit up red. A massive high-velocity signature, too fast for a Terran patrol ship, too large for debris, was vectoring directly toward 4 Lambda. Impact estimated less than 60 seconds. It wasn't Mars Command sending a ship for Kilo 7. It was the Unarmored. They hadn't chosen war. They had simply been discovered possessing the superior material science. Now they were coming to reclaim it. Orek looked at the timer, then at the docking port. He had to decide if he was leaving with the sample, or if the Unarmored was arriving to destroy the only hope humanity had left. He wrenched open the Thanatographer's hatch and scrambled inside. Orek não checou o contador novamente. Não havia necessidade. A assinatura cinemática preenchia o display secundário, crescente negro contra o campo de estrelas. Ele acionou o sequenciador. The Thanatographer, drone de transporte construído para o silêncio, respondeu com rangido gutural de metal antigo. As pinças magnéticas liberaram-se parcialmente, mas os motores principais falharam em acender. Os sistemas, dormentes por anos, engasgaram com o súbito pico de energia. Orek rasgou o painel do console, buscando o bypass manual. Suas mãos, usualmente precisas no cálculo da falha, eram movidas apenas por urgência desesperada. Ele tinha que sair agora. Ele ouviu o rugido grave do vaso que se aproximava do lado de fora do casco. Som que vibrava em seus ossos, não apenas na placa do convés. O primeiro impacto não foi uma colisão, mas um pulso energético ressonante. Atingiu 4 lambda como um diapasão gigantesco, não destruindo, mas desmantelando. As luzes da cabine piscaram e morreram. Iluminação de emergência, fria e azul, substituiu-as, lançando sombras grotescas dos controles. Um segundo pico de energia atingiu The Thanatographer. Aurek gritou quando sua cabeça bateu no display principal. A dor era instantânea, aguda e imediata, lembrando-o de que ele era carne, não carboneto de silício. O casco externo do drone gemeu, o metal torcendo sob o estresse imprevisto. Ele tentou a ignição novamente, forçando energia pelos conduítes manuais. Os motores falharam em atingir o impulso necessário. The Thanatographer estava preso no campo de detritos de 4 lambda, um peso morto amarrado por pinças semi-liberadas. A janela de 60 segundos havia evaporado. O grande sinal havia sumido da tela, o que significava que o vaso não armado estava camuflado ou havia atracado. Eles estavam na estação. Aurek havia trocado um dilema remoto por uma confrontação imediata e letal. Ele ativou um scanner externo de baixa potência, uma necessidade na escuridão que se instalava. O ar dentro da cabine ficava pesado, cheirando a ozônio e fiação queimada. Ele tinha que alcançar o duto de manutenção principal e o sistema de energia terciária, ou sucumbiria à asfixia em minutos. Aurek arrancou a escotilha, ignorando a dor pulsante em sua têmpora. O convés estava empoeirado com fragmentos cristalinos, estilhaços do pulso ressonante. Ele estava em cima dos destroços de seu próprio veículo de fuga. Ele precisava de Kilo 7. Ele cambaleou de volta ao laboratório, onde a luz azul revelava a câmara de contenção. Localizou a unidade de contenção de campo portátil. Uma caixa revestida de chumbo projetada para a recuperação de alto risco biológico, e transferiu cuidadosamente a placa de titânio contendo o fragmento Kilo 7. O espinho cristalino escuro estava agora seguro, pesado e frio em suas mãos. Movendo-se em direção ao alçapão de manutenção, ele ouviu o som. Não o ritmo rápido e seco de botas marine, mas um som deslizado e sussurrante, intercalado com cliques metálicos agudos. O som de material superior se movendo com eficiência aterrorizante. Aurek se enfiou no duto escuro, arrastando o container pesado atrás de si. O tecido de seu macacão raspava contra as costelas metálicas geladas do sistema de ventilação. O odor metálico no ar misturava-se a um novo cheiro, algo orgânico, almiscarado e levemente ácido. Ele estava compartilhando o ar com eles. Ele verificou seu scanner portátil, funcionando com bateria local. 2 sinais de calor massivos, provavelmente a equipe de abordagem não armada, estavam se movendo rapidamente, convergindo para o laboratório principal onde Kilo 7 havia estado. O sorriso amargo em seu rosto não era de triunfo, mas de autoaversão. Ele percebeu que o duto que escolheu estava canalizando-o para o exaustor térmico principal da estação, o ponto de entrada mais provável para o vaso não armado. Ele não estava se escondendo. Estava caminhando direto para a armadilha. De repente, seu scanner detectou uma terceira assinatura. Pequena, passiva e estranhamente fria, aninhada em um compartimento de carga não utilizado 2 níveis abaixo. Não era Kilo 7, nem era um dos massivos invasores. Era fraco, mal registrando acima do ruído de fundo. Estava se movendo, lentamente, quase como detritos à deriva em gravidade zero. Aurek parou, seus pulmões ardendo com o esforço e o ar rarefeito. Por que um único, passivo sinal térmico estaria à deriva perto do núcleo da estação, enquanto dois caçadores se aproximavam do objetivo principal? O mistério complicava tudo. Não era uma ameaça imediata, mas uma variável que ele poderia explorar. Ele ajustou o curso, abandonando a rota de alto risco do exaustor térmico. Seguiu em direção ao compartimento de carga. De mal em pior. De mal a pior. Mas era um novo caminho. Aurek irrompeu no compartimento de carga, seus músculos protestando a brutalidade do rastejamento. O ar ali era gélido, espesso com o silêncio de total abandono. Ele localizou a origem do sinal térmico fraco. Um pod de carga cilíndrico padrão, levemente amassado. Estava chacoalhando suavemente. Aurek sacou sua única ferramenta, o bisturi de alta frequência que ele havia projetado, e se preparou para um encontro letal. Ele esperava um drone danificado, talvez um robô de manutenção explodido. Ele selou a escotilha atrás de si e cortou a trava magnética da porta do pod. Abriu-se com um chiado. Dentro, aninhada entre rolos de cabo óptico desativado, havia uma criatura. Era pequena, aproximadamente do tamanho de uma criança humana, e inconfundivelmente não armada. Mas ao contrário do formidável Kilo 7, que era um fragmento de perfeição material, esta era de pele macia, frágil e emitindo um gemido fraco e agudo. Era um juvenil, assustado e muito vivo, um infante Zitiana. A lógica de Aurek desmoronou completamente. Ele estava preparado para destruir um fragmento blindado para salvar milhões. Ele não estava preparado para abandonar um filhote assustado da espécie inimiga aos seus próprios caçadores. Ele viu seus olhos grandes, negros e cristalinos. Olhos que espelhavam a dureza implacável de Kilo 7, mas que estavam cheios de terror puro e infantil. Isso não era uma amostra material. Era a consequência da guerra que ele estava travando. Uma vida que desafiava a classificação. A realidade tática o atingiu como uma onda de plasma frio. As duas grandes assinaturas, os caçadores, haviam mudado de curso. Não estavam mais se movendo em direção ao laboratório. Estavam vindo para cá, em direção ao aumento da saída térmica do pod de carga aberto. O medo do infante Zitiana havia aumentado sua temperatura localizada, transmitindo sua posição. Ele tinha, talvez, 20 segundos. Ele teve que fazer uma escolha impossível. Usar o tempo precioso para detonar a carga que carregava, vaporizando o Kilo 7 e destruindo a única contramedida comprovada, ou salvar a criança e arriscar que o disruptor fosse implantado com base em dados falhos, potencialmente desencadeando uma catástrofe evolucionária. A culpa de Elias, de todos os marines mortos, guerreava com o horror primitivo e inegável de abandonar esta criatura indefesa. Ele escolheu a vida. Aurek pegou o infante Zitiana, aconchegando-o em seus macacões contra seu peito, protegendo-o com o container revestido de chumbo de Kilo 7. Ele não ativou a sequência de detonação. Ele se virou para correr de volta em direção aos dutos, mas antes que alcançasse a escotilha, a pesada porta pressurizada do compartimento de carga sibilou e abriu-se com finalidade ensurdecedora. 3 figuras massivas, negras como carvão e impossivelmente densas, estavam emolduradas pela luz azul de emergência. Eram os não armados, sua presença silenciosa, predatória e absoluta. Eles não falaram, não hesitaram. Seu movimento era um borrão de precisão orgânica. Aurek sentiu o peso de Kilo 7 em suas mãos, o peso do infante Zitiana, pressionado contra seu peito, e o conhecimento nauseante de que ele havia entregado tanto a solução quanto o problema diretamente nas mãos do inimigo. A figura da frente ergueu um apêndice. Não uma arma, mas uma mão. Suas garras de carboneto de silício brilhando na luz pálida. Aurek estava encurralado, capturado e desarmado de tudo, exceto o fragmento que o inimigo viera recuperar. O jogo havia terminado. The immense black form of the lead Zitiana paused 3 meters from Aurek, framed by the cold blue emergency lights. Its silicon carbide claws, razor-sharp, remained relaxed. It was not a posture of aggression, but of overwhelming patient presence. Aurek stood absolutely still, the heavy lead casing of specimen Kilo 7 pressing against his ribs, the terrified Zithiana juvenile, Zji, silent and shivering in his arms. He had braced for kinetic impact, for the sound of shattering carbon fiber, but instead the cargo bay filled with an absolute, profound silence that felt like the moment before a structure collapses. The massive Zithiana extended its appendage not towards the heavy container, but slowly, meticulously, towards the shivering infant. Its eyes, massive and crystalline, held none of the bestial aggression Aurek had expected, only a terrible, focused intelligence. Aurek's specialized training, the years spent classifying the physics of failure, forced his analytical mind past the paralyzing fear. He noted the subtle, nearly imperceptible vibration in the deck plating beneath his thin boots. It was the same infrasound hum he had registered when Kilo 7 resisted the molecular solvent, the resonant frequency of the silicon carbide lattice itself. The Zithiana was communicating, not with sound waves meant for air, but with structural vibrations transmitted through the very metal of the station. Aurek closed his eyes, forcing his inner ear to focus, translating the pattern of vibration against the databanks in his memory. It wasn't language in the Terran sense. It was pure structural mathematics, a communication built on the understanding of material science. The fragment is contained. Release the juvenile. The fragment is irrelevant. Aurek opened his eyes, a spike of cold disbelief shooting through him. They didn't care about Kilo 7. They didn't come for the sample he had risked everything to protect or destroy. They came for the child. The material evidence of material superiority, the silicon carbide lattice, was merely a piece of debris to them. The lead Zithiana shifted its focus, and the vibration changed, becoming sharper, more urgent, vibrating directly against the lead containment unit Aurek still clutched. The scalpel. The design is flawed. The time is 45 minutes. The scalpel. Protocol Omega. The weaponized sonic disruptor. They knew its designation. They knew the time frame. The structural language intensified, now conveying complex diagrams of stress fractures and feedback loops. Aurek's brain struggled to process the sheer volume of data being pushed through the metal. The Zithiana was showing him the physics of his own failure. The weaponized disruptor, calibrated with the incomplete data from Fragment Gamma 3, would not merely turn their internal armor to dust. It would strike a frequency that destabilized the fundamental biolattice structure, but instead of benign disintegration, it would induce a rapid, catastrophic phase shift. The result flashed in Aurek's mind. The Zithiana forces would instantly mutate, their silicon carbide structure collapsing into a highly reactive, volatile silicon hydride cloud, toxic and evolutionarily unstable. The disruptor wasn't a precision scalpel. It was a bioweapon designed to create a self-propagating plague that would consume every Terran and Zithiana system it touched. Mars Command had ordered an extinction event, not a tactical victory. The sheer horror of the revelation anchored him. All his ethical struggle, all his fear of becoming a monster, was irrelevant. He hadn't been fighting Valerius and the weaponization of science. He had been fighting a flawed calculus of species survival. Aurek lowered the Zithiana Juvenile, setting it gently on the cold deck plating. The lead Zithiana paused, absorbing the action. Aurek felt the vibration shift from urgency to cold instruction. Protocol Omega will fire in 45 minutes. The flaw is fatal. We cannot communicate with Sol System. You must activate the counter-frequency. Aurek felt a profound sense of self-loathing. He had delayed the upload to preserve his morality, only to discover that his refusal had pushed Mars to use bad data, accelerating an apocalypse. He hadn't stopped a bomb. He had supercharged a biological nightmare. He met the crystalline gaze of the Zithiana adult. The structural communication was now a stark, cold offer. Your counter-frequency blueprint. The scalpel, not the bomb. We will provide the energy vector. You will save your species from its own arrogance. Here was the impossible dilemma. To cooperate meant actively betraying the Colonial Guard, violating every oath, and partnering with an enemy species whose methods were terrifyingly efficient. To refuse meant watching Mars commit a systemic suicide, and taking the Zithiana with them. He was being asked to choose functional treason over moral purity, knowing that failure meant the end of all organized life in the sector. Aurek's hands, thin and scarred, trembled slightly. He thought of Elias, killed because Aurek's structural warnings were ignored. He thought of the 500,000 Marines whose steel armor failed against this elegant biological structure. Their deaths had been pointless, sacrificed to Terran hubris. To allow Mars to deploy Protocol Omega would make those 500,000 deaths merely the opening footnote to an entire volume of annihilation. He looked at the Zithiana Juvenile, now crawling slowly toward the protection of the massive adult. Life, in its purest, most fragile form, dictated the calculus. He had chosen life in the duct, and he chose it again now. "Show me the vector," Aurek whispered, his voice dry and foreign in the silence. The Zithiana adult moved its claw, not toward Aurek, but toward the dark blue transport drone. The thanatographer, still partially locked down in the maintenance bay. The Zithiana were not leaving. They intended to use the old station and him as a relay. Aurek reached down and unclipped the small, heavily shielded data drive containing his original, non-weaponized surgical disruptor blueprints. The solution. He held it out. The Zithiana did not take it. Instead, the adult placed its massive appendage on Aurek's shoulder. The contact was shocking. A burst of structural data that felt like a cold, alien electric current running through his spine. He realized the Zithiana were integrating their processing power with his mind, sharing the necessary schematics for the counter-frequency array. Aurek was no longer simply a thanatologist. He was now a conduit, an operational limb of the Zithiana structural engineers. He moved toward the thanatographer, guided by the cold, precise data flowing into his consciousness. He tore open the main power distribution panel, bypassing the remote lockdown Valerius had initiated. Power required, maximum, core overload. To generate the necessary power spike for the counter-frequency broadcast, Aurek had to dump the entire energy reserves of 4 Lambda into the drone's transmission array. It meant destroying the station, vaporizing all remaining samples, including Kilo 7, the evidence that could have saved humanity ethically, and potentially incinerating himself. Orek didn't hesitate. He began connecting the crossfeeds, bypassing the thermal regulators. Sacrifice was now the only viable currency. He had betrayed his species, but he had chosen survival for both species over the moral vanity of loyalty to a doomed command. As the system indicators flashed into the red, signaling imminent core rupture, the structural data stream from the Zithiana adult changed one last time. It was a complex data package, too large for mere schematics, too precise for random noise. It was a fragment of command log, a historical footnote that explained the physics of their conflict. Orek understood the transmission instantly. The flawed data, Fragment Gamma 3, the data Valerius was relying on to deploy the catastrophic weapon, had not been a random sample gathered from the battlefield. It had been intentionally fed to the Terran salvage crews months ago. The Zithiana had known Mars Command was searching for a kinetic countermeasure. They had deliberately introduced structurally compromised data into the Terran system, engineering a predictable, catastrophic failure in the subsequent weapon design. They hadn't been defending against invasion. They had engineered the Terran self-destruct mechanism. They were not just structurally superior, they were strategically terrifying. They had set the trap, and Arek, the thanatologist specializing in failure, was now their operative, tasked with cleaning up the mess before the trap consumed the Zithiana too. Orel felt the sickening clarity of absolute betrayal. His entire frantic mission had been a sophisticated mop-up operation for the enemy. The system alarms began shrieking, louder than the human threshold of pain. The core overload reached critical mass. Orek slammed the trigger for the transmission array, sending his counter-frequency scalpel across the light years towards the approaching warhead. He had won. He had saved humanity from itself. But the price was staggering. Not only had he sacrificed his world, his evidence and his allegiance, but he now faced the cold, absolute truth that the unarmored hadn't chosen war, but structural domination. And he had just proved their hypothesis, that Terran material science, powered by Terran arrogance, was easily manipulated into self-destruction. He slumped back against the vibrating console, the image of the Zithiana adult, silent and calculating, burned into his mind. He had done the right thing for the wrong reasons, orchestrated by the wrong people. Then, the final chilling thought. The counter-frequency array had fired, but the sheer energy spike had not only overloaded the core, it had also permanently fused the flight controls of the Thanatographer. He was trapped on the failing station, an architect of galactic structural disaster, surrounded by the enemy, waiting for the inevitable consequences of his costly, critical error. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The cost of that critical error arrived faster than expected, and it was paid in full, with interest. The detonation of 4 Lambda's energy core had been surgical, aimed outward, a precision strike to fuel the counter-frequency broadcast. But the subsequent structural failure was total. The deck beneath Orek's boots was not vibrating with communication now, but with the random, violent spasms of a collapsing station. He was still slumped against the console of the Thanatographer, the fused controls mocking his attempt at escape. The air scrubber was dead. The synthetic decay was replaced by the acrid, heavy smoke of scorched polymer and metal. Aurek, the thanatologist, was now trapped in the wreckage he had personally designed. He felt the immense weight lift from his shoulder as the Zithiana adult retracted its appendage. The alien was silent, its crystalline eyes fixed on the chaos around them, seemingly unmoved by the imminent structural failure. The infant Zithiana, which had been set down, was now safely nestled within the protective shadow of the adult. They had achieved their objective. The self-destruct mechanism of Protocol Omega was neutralized. Aurek, their reluctant operative, had served his purpose. He tried to stand, but his legs failed. The energy surge, amplified by the alien's integration, had left him feeling hollowed out, as if every nerve ending had been frayed and incinerated. He was exhausted down to his biological core, the metallic taste of burnt ozone mixed with blood from a split lip. He looked at the remaining Zithiana in the bay. 2 more adults, massive and silent, guarding the open hatch of their vessel, which was now magnetically locked to 4 Lambda's failing hull. The lead Zithiana turned its attention fully back to Aurek. The structural vibration began again, but this time it was slower, weighted with cold finality, transmitted through the vibrating metal of the drone's shell. The trap is cleansed. The data is recorded. Aurek understood. He wasn't a hero, a savior, or even a prisoner of war. He was a piece of forensic data, a case study in Terran material and psychological susceptibility. A different vibration followed, sharp and insistent, focusing on the external airlock access. The Zithiana paused, its posture shifting from calculating patience to alert, predatory readiness. Terran command, they are not aware of the scalpel's failure. A third signal was incoming, but this one was audio, relayed through the ancient surviving local comms array, a signal Aurek recognized instantly. Director Valerius, Thanatologist Aurek, status update. We registered an unauthorized energy spike emanating from 4 Lambda 2 minutes ago. Explain the core overload. The synthetic voice of Valerius was calm, a chilling testament to his psychological control. Aurek tried to answer, to lie, but the smoke caught in his throat. The Zithiana adult moved, its massive claw slicing through the comms cable attached to the thanatographer, with silent surgical efficiency. The loss of contact did not deter Valerius. A moment later, a new signal hit the local external sensors, projected directly from the incoming Terran vessel. It was an ultra-low frequency acoustic pulse, designed not for communication, but for threat. A message delivered via sonic pressure wave, felt more than heard. You have failed to provide optimal data, Doctor. We are retrieving Kilo 7 now. Prepare for boarding procedures. Resistance is structurally inefficient. Aurek knew what that meant. Valerius wasn't sending a team to retrieve him or Kilo 7. He was sending a retrieval unit equipped with a high-yield, short-range kinetic breaching charge, designed to punch directly through 4 Lambda's hull and extract the entire containment area. They believed Aurek had destroyed the data, and that the sample was still intact, but now compromised. They were coming to secure the evidence and punish the operative. The structural vibration from the Zithiana intensified, conveying a complex assessment of the Terran approach vessel. Fast, heavily armored, 3 minutes to breach. Your life is inconvenient data. Disposal pending. Aurek understood. The Zithiana had used him, and now, with the Terran forces approaching, His presence was a liability. They had saved the sector from self-induced biological annihilation, but only by engineering the failure. And Aurek was the only human who knew the depth of their strategic mastery. He was disposable, a loose end. He managed to push himself onto his knees, his head swimming from the smoke and exhaustion. He saw the cold calculation in the massive crystalline eyes. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had been preparing for that moment since he first arrived on 4 Lambda. The crushing weight was the realization of his complete lack of agency, the devastating truth that his moral struggle had been a controlled variable in an alien strategic calculation. Why do I still fight? The thought was a rasp in his mind. For Elias? He is dead. For humanity? I just betrayed it. For principle? What principle? I am merely an operative in the enemy's mop-up crew. He looked down at his trembling, scarred hands. They were designed to analyze failure, but they had only engineered a larger one. He had allowed himself to be manipulated, sacrificing his life and his integrity for a short-term survival that didn't even include him. This was the bottom of the well. There was no nobility left, only the cold, hard mathematics of his own predictable failure. He slowly moved his hand toward the compartment where he had stored his only personal defense, a small, high-frequency, kinetic pistol, designed for internal structural defense. A useless relic against the silicon carbide armor. He didn't intend to fight the Zithiana. He intended to stop existing as data. If he was to be disposed of, he would choose the method. He would deny them the final analysis of his self-termination. As his numb fingers brushed the cold metal of the pistol grip, the structural vibration from the Zithiana changed, suddenly sharp and demanding. It was a complex data packet, overriding the noise of the collapsing station. Wait! Scanner intercept. Sub-frequency detected. Aurek felt a profound sense of disorientation. The Zithiana were displaying an internal schematic on his mind's eye, a diagram of the Terran vessel approaching. Not the main kinetic charge array, but a tiny tertiary antenna array, shielded heavily, running on a completely separate low-power frequency. It was broadcasting a code, a Terran encryption code, standard military issue, but one Aurek had specialized knowledge of. It was the Ghost Protocol signal, designed for deep undercover extraction missions, used when the retrieval team needed to communicate with a target believed to be hostile, compromised, or under observation. The Zithiana vibrated the translation. They do not intend to breach the station. They are coming to exfiltrate. The code is for the target. The target is you. Aurek's blood ran cold. Valerius's calm, detached tone. The quick deployment. The failure to confirm Kilo 7's status before launch. It wasn't about retrieval or punishment. The Ghost Protocol signal was used exclusively by the Thanatologist's former parent organization, the Colonial Strategic Analysis Bureau, the very organization that classified Aurek as a high-risk operative and assigned him to 4 Lambda years ago. They hadn't sent him to a decommissioned station. They had sent him to a functional, highly isolated monitoring post. Aurek understood the transmission instantly. Aurek, the Protocol Omega deployment was a test. Gamma 3 was a known failure. Your reaction was the targeted data. Proceed to exfiltration point Delta 9. Time 90 seconds. The Zithiana pulsed the data again, adding their own commentary. They knew we were watching. They waited for your treason. It was never about the weapon. It was about your betrayal. They wanted to confirm your structural failure. Auric felt the final, crushing wave of humiliation. He hadn't been fighting a war. He had been participating in a meticulously designed psychological experiment orchestrated by both sides. His moral struggle, his choice of treason over extinction, his sacrifice of allegiance, all of it was simply data, proving to his own people that his loyalty to them was structurally weak. He was not a hero or a traitor, or even an enemy operative. He was a rat in a maze, and he had performed exactly as expected. The Zithiana adult moved, its claw pressing the lead containment unit of Kilo 7 into Auric's hand. A final instruction transmitted through the metal. They want you, the operative. Take the fragment. It is the only proof of our domination. Your final task. Infiltrate their network. We will provide the path. Do not fail again. The Zithiana were not killing him. They were handing him back to his original masters. But now, as their sleeper agent, loaded with the material proof of their superiority, Kilo 7, and tasked with the impossible mission of destroying the very people who had just validated their strategic prediction of his structural weakness. Auric swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal and exhaustion. He had 90 seconds to reach Delta 9, with the only evidence of alien mastery in his hands, destined to rejoin a command structure that had designed his ultimate moral collapse. He forced himself to stand. His legs were shaky, his vision blurred, but the knowledge, the absolute cold clarity of his situation gave him a terrible focus. He was trapped between two masters, both of whom viewed him as a tool of material science, but only one offered him a mechanism for revenge. He clutched Kilo 7, the material verdict against humanity. He ignored the pain and the smoke. The final, terrible, and impossible choice had been made for him. He was going home. He stumbled out of the Thanatographer, turning his back on the Zithiana adults, who watched him with unreadable crystalline silence. He was running towards the pre-designated airlock, the knowledge that he was marching into the maw of his own failure pressing down on him. 90 seconds. His time was up, but the game was just beginning. The structural spasms of 4 Lambda increased from tremor to violent arrhythmic convulsion. Deck plates buckled, sending metallic shrapnel flying past Auric's face. He was running, or rather staggering, his legs operating on sheer reflex, guided by the cold, precise data streaming from the Zithiana adult he had left behind. 90 seconds. The Terran vessel, sleek and brutally kinetic, was nearly docked. Auric clutched the heavy lead containment unit of Kilo 7. The container was cold, its weight a dense, constant reminder of his impossible mission. He was a fugitive running toward his jailers, a traitor carrying the supreme evidence of his master's intellectual inferiority. His only advantage was the secret, the structural map provided by the enemy, which detailed the exact path to Delta 9, bypassing the immediate, catastrophic collapse zones. The structural map was not perfect. As Auric rounded a corner into the main personnel corridor, a primary bulkhead seal failed violently, venting atmosphere and freezing vapor instantly. The vacuum differential sucked the air from his lungs. He instinctively slammed his body against a stable wall conduit, pulling Kilo 7 close. The centrifugal force, combined with his exhaustion, was nearly enough to rip his grip loose. This is the failure of my biology, Auric thought, tasting the metallic tang of his own exhaustion. He had always been too physically frail for true military service, suited only for the cold science of failure analysis. But that very weakness now served him. Because he was failing, he was unpredictable. He allowed his body to slide, using the momentum of the vacuum to propel him across the 30 meters of exposed corridor, sacrificing control for velocity. He struck the far wall hard, but he was closer to the airlock. 60 seconds. He reached the maintenance access tube leading directly to Delta 9. The tube was narrow, designed for service drones, not human transit. He shoved Kilo 7 ahead of him, scraping raw skin from his knuckles. The Zithiana data stream wasn't guiding him. It was driving him, pushing his organic limits past the threshold of pain, treating his body like a flawed but functional machine needing extreme calibration. He burst into the airlock chamber. Delta 9 was structurally intact, bathed in the red glow of emergency containment. The heavy Terran extraction shuttle was locked onto the exterior hull, its massive clamps thrumming. The airlock display read, "Standby. Airlock integrity pending." They were waiting for his activation sequence. 30 seconds. Orek stumbled to the access terminal. He couldn't just open the door. He had to enter the Ghost Protocol authorization sequence, confirming his identity as the compromised asset. This was the final terrifying moment of his moral collapse. He was confirming his treason to his old masters, letting them know their experiment was a success, only to use that moment of perceived victory to plant a time bomb. He put his trembling, scarred hands on the interface. The Zithiana data flowed from Kilo 7's proximity, a cold, non-verbal instruction that integrated with his own consciousness. It wasn't just a path to infiltration. It was a payload of structural code, designed to overwrite his identity and embed the Zitiana into the Colonial Guard's central command network. He began the sequence. Orek. Status. Compromised. Extraction required. The airlock hissed in recognition. Valerius's synthetic voice filtered through the internal comms of the Terran shuttle, cut through the noise of the collapsing station, calm and utterly devoid of emotion. Orek, you are performing within optimal parameters. We are registering high levels of environmental degradation and acute trauma in your biosignals. This data confirms the integrity of our assessment regarding your stress threshold. The confrontation was here, but it wasn't a fight. It was a debriefing. Valerius wasn't interested in Kilo 7. He was interested in Orek's predictable behavior under duress. Orek fought through the surge of shame and rage. He had to maintain his facade as the broken operative. Core overload was necessary, Orek managed, his voice thick with smoke and desperation. Attempted defense against the unarmored vessel. Kilo 7 secured. Of course, Doctor. Your narrative is consistent with expected moral self-justification, Valerius replied chillingly. Now, upload the integrity report, and we will initiate full extraction. We have ample time to process your failure on the return journey. Failure. Valerius had used the word that defined Orek's life, transforming it from a scientific classification into a personal condemnation. This was the moment Orek had to turn the blade. Orek did not upload the standard integrity report. Instead, he initiated the high-frequency diagnostic software he had carried since the beginning, the Scalpel Blueprint, modified by the Zithiana. He used the Trauma Data Transfer, TDT, which prioritized massive data packets detailing the physical stresses of the operative as a mask. He injected the Zithiana code, the infiltration payload, into the TDT stream. It was a digital virus, disguised as his personal structural collapse data. The system accepted it, interpreting the massive influx of alien code as the chaos of his psychological breakdown. The physical feedback was instantaneous and excruciating. The Zithiana integration surged, forcing the enormous data packet through his neural pathways and into the Terran system via the airlock's biometric interface. Orek's vision went white. He screamed, a raw, primal sound that was instantly muffled by the rush of depressurization as the outer airlock began to cycle. He slammed his forehead against the cold metal of the interface panel, forcing the connection. He felt the sharp, crystalline data flow, and simultaneously the pain of his nervous system rebelling against the forced input. His hands spasmed, his fingers curled into useless trembling hooks. Data transfer registered. High variance detected. Doctor, stabilize your physiological response. Valerius commanded, his voice now tinged with annoyance, not concern. You are contaminating the sample integrity with unnecessary noise. Orek lifted his head, blood dripping from his split lip onto the console, mixing with the scorched residue. He had 20 seconds before the inner door opened, exposing him to the Terran Marines. The data stream confirmed successful embedding. The Zithiana code was now a ghost node deep within the Colonial Strategic Analysis Bureau network. Orek leaned back, exhausted, staring blankly at the pulsing red light. He had won the technological confrontation. He had turned the weapon of his own moral failure against his masters. The inner door hissed open. 2 fully armored Marines stood framed in the aperture, their kinetics raised, trained on his chest. Valerius's voice returned, softer, almost educational. I will tell you the truth now, Orek. We did not need Kilo 7 for the weapon. We only needed it as the focal point for your moral decision. Your refusal to upload Protocol Omega, your subsequent frantic actions, your calculated treason, it all confirmed your structural weakness. You are too empathic, too prone to self-sacrifice. You are unfit for command, but perfectly suited for observation. The Marines approached, their boots steady on the vibrating deck. But now you are secured, Valerius continued. The data on the unarmored's material structure is irrelevant. Your reaction was the target, and you performed beautifully, Doctor. Orek looked up at the Marines, then back at the bloodied console. He had succeeded in the infiltration, but Valerius, in his cold, absolute logic, had already calculated the outcome of the battle, even if he didn't realize the hidden payload. Orek forced a raspy whisper. You calculated my morality. As a weakness, that was your failure, Director. Valerius paused, a moment of synthetic silence before responding. A flaw in calculation, perhaps, but a necessary one. You are now returning to the fold, Doctor. You have failed your ethical structure, but you have maintained the functional utility necessary for your next assignment. The Marines reached Orek. One grabbed his arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. Orek did not resist. He clutched Kilo 7, the lead container heavy in his numb hand. The cost was staggering, immediate and visible. His nervous system felt shredded, his body operating on borrowed time. But the deeper wound was the confirmation that his entire struggle had been meaningless theatre. He hadn't stopped an apocalypse. He had merely fulfilled a scientific hypothesis about his own predictable self-destruction. He was dragged through the airlock, leaving the collapsing ruins of 4 Lambda behind. The Zithiana had won the strategic war by turning human arrogance, both military and moral, into a self-destruct mechanism. And Orek, the man who catalogued failure, was now the walking embodiment of that structural collapse. He was shoved into the belly of the Terran shuttle. As the airlock sealed with a heavy final clang, the last structural vibration came, not from the collapsing station, but from the lead containment unit of Kilo 7 in his hand. It was a single, simple data point, an instruction from the silent, massive Zithiana, waiting outside the shattered hull of Pure Lambda. You are now the virus. Grow. Orek closed his eyes, accepting the cold reality. He was a traitor twice over, a compromised asset, physically broken and permanently trapped between 2 warring material philosophies. He had achieved victory only by embracing the role of the enemy's sleeper agent. The game was over, but the war of infiltration, the only war he could now fight, had just begun. He was going home, a perfect specimen of structural failure, carrying the one truth that could still shatter his species from the inside out. The airlock cycle completed with a metallic, decisive clang, a sound of finality that was absolute and cold. Orek's consciousness, already frayed by the Zithiana data surge, slipped into a fractured twilight. When he finally registered movement and light again, hours had passed, measured only by the dull throbbing behind his eyes and the sterile efficiency of his new environment. He was no longer on 4 Lambda. He lay strapped to a containment gurney within the pressurized belly of the Terran shuttle, a temporary medical restraint designed to ensure the integrity of the asset. The environment was clinically clean, smelling of disinfectant and recycled oxygen, the complete antithesis of the toxic chaos he had just left. The metallic tang of ozone and synthetic decay was gone, replaced by the scent of controlled antiseptic arrogance. His physical losses were immediately apparent. His hands, thin and scarred, were no longer trembling from emotional distress, but from neurological damage. The fine motor skills required for a lifetime of precise thanatology were permanently compromised. He tried to uncurl his right index finger. It responded with a jagged, uncontrolled spasm. The Zithiana integration had successfully used his nervous system as a high-speed data conduit, and the cost was structural. He was physically damaged, permanently redefined by the enemy's efficiency, but the Zithiana had also ensured the preservation of his most vital tool, the lead containment unit of Kilo 7, secured firmly to his chest by a secondary strap. Valerius's Marines had left it there, dismissing the physical fragment of alien bone as secondary data, an unnecessary complication, a sign of the deep-seated Terran conviction that they had fully understood and neutralized the threat. A monitor hummed above his head, displaying his vital signs alongside a continuous, real-time read of his neurological stress levels. Valerius's ultimate victory was this. Orek's emotional and psychological breakdown was now a data stream, classified and categorized. A voice, the same synthetic calm, filtered through the gurney's built-in comm unit. Thanatologist Orek, welcome aboard the Purity of Intent. We are 8 hours from transfer to the Sol system. Your physiological stress levels remain high, though consistent with calculated parameters. The Ghost Protocol infiltration code was successful. Your position is confirmed. Orek forced his eyes open, looking at the ceiling, not bothering to reply. We understand your current emotional profile. Valerius continued, his tone that of a professor lecturing a particularly frustrating specimen. Guilt, shame, betrayal. These are all useful metrics. We were betting on your fundamental human weakness, empathy, to ensure you chose cooperation over extinction. You delivered the precise data point required, Doctor. Your structural failure was anticipated and leveraged. The injustice wasn't the betrayal. It was the absolute cold predictability of it. His entire moral struggle, his desperate flight, his treason, all of it had been an experiment in material stress on human ethical structures. And he had failed the experiment exactly as predicted. But Valerius had only analyzed the Terran side of the failure. Aurek focused inward, past the pain and the humiliation, concentrating on the digital parasite the Zithiana had uploaded into his neural pathways and then into the Terran system. The code, disguised as his psychological collapse data, was now deeply embedded in the Strategic Analysis Bureau network. It was silent, crystalline, and designed not for kinetic destruction, but for the dissolution of institutional logic. You are the virus. Grow. Aurek began the work. He couldn't move his hands, but he could think. He mentally unspooled the Zithiana payload, using his thanatologist's expertise to analyze the Terran system architecture that flashed across his consciousness, courtesy of the embedded code. The Zithiana virus was elegant. It didn't seek to destroy firewalls. It sought to redefine validity. It was a structural collapse mechanism disguised as an efficiency protocol. It would slowly and systematically corrupt the core algorithms of Terran Command, making logistical decisions prone to minute, predictable errors. Errors that prioritized immediate kinetic victory over long-term strategic integrity. It was designed to make Terran Command destroy itself, slowly, from within, by doubling down on their arrogance. Aurek saw the genius of it. The Zithiana didn't need a bomb. They just needed to ensure the Terran military became more like Valerius. We have already analyzed the Kilo 7 fragment you secured, Valerius said, interrupting Aurek's analysis. Remarkable tissue density, certainly, but ultimately irrelevant. We are focusing on counter-kinetic shielding development, Doctor. We are developing steel that will shatter their biological structure. Aurek felt a profound cold pity for the director. The arrogance was structural. They still believed the war was a problem of material composition, not strategic intelligence. They believed they could armor their way out of a conflict designed to exploit their very nature. Aurek closed his eyes, focusing on the pain in his useless hands. This was his permanent scar, the physical reminder of his ethical, structural failure. He had been broken, but in his brokenness he had found his new purpose. Redemption was not possible. Forgiveness was irrelevant. There was only the task. He realized the cure for human arrogance wasn't material. It was internal. He had to become the silent agent of intellectual dissolution, ensuring Valerius's cold logic became the universal failure mode. The Terran shuttle docked silently in the cold vastness of a remote refueling platform, far from the primary Sol docks, a necessary precaution for a compromised asset. The internal lock hissed open. Aurek, still strapped to the gurney, felt the shift in gravity plating as the shuttle locked down. Two new Marines entered silent, professional. They detached the gurney straps. Aurek forced himself to sit up, clutching the lead container of Kilo 7. He was exhausted, but the viral code inside him was humming, vibrant. The lead Marine spoke, his voice clipped and routine. Dr. Orek, transfer point reached. You are proceeding to processing. Hand over the specimen now. Orek looked at the heavy lead box. Kilo 7 was no longer a sample of material science. It was the physical verdict delivered by an entire civilization upon another. It was the material proof of Terran inferiority, and the key to his continued utility. He shook his head, a single definitive motion. The tremor in his hands was evident. "The specimen stays with me," Orek rasped, his voice still ragged from the smoke of EU4 Lambda. Director Valerius required the viability data for transfer. This is the only physical guarantee of that data's integrity. The Marine hesitated, looking at the silent data monitor that confirmed Orek was classified as structurally unstable but functionally compliant. Valerius hadn't issued an override regarding the sample's immediate separation. The bureaucracy of command was now a vulnerability. "Very well, Doctor. Proceed." Orek stood, unsteady on his feet, Kilo 7 heavy in his numb grip. He was led off the shuttle and into the antiseptic silence of the platform. He walked past windows overlooking the distant cold light of Sul, a star that seemed impossibly far away, indifferent to the small human drama of structural failure and ethical collapse. The vastness of space offered no comfort, no guidance, only perspective. He had started this journey focusing on the catastrophic failure of Terran steel against alien bone. He ended it realizing that the true structural failure was the belief that superior armor could ever compensate for inferior understanding. His only redemption was to ensure that understanding, the material truth carried by Kilo 7 and the digital truth carried in his own corrupted mind, finally broke through the rigid structure of human pride. Orek had classified countless failures in his life. He had analyzed wreckage, documented molecular decay, and accounted for every single fragment of material science that led to death on Demetra Prime. He knew the cost of underestimation. He stopped, momentarily disoriented, allowing the two Marines to flank him. He felt the Zithiana virus deep in his consciousness, preparing its silent growth. He was returning to the center of power, an architect of internal collapse, carrying the perfect, permanent evidence of his species' doom. The initial report he had read years ago, detailing the first engagement, came back to him with chilling clarity. The Marines had laughed at the enemy's perceived weakness. Orek had laughed at their lack of armor. The laughter had stopped long ago. He stood there, broken and alone, clutching the weight of Kilo 7, the weight of silicon carbide, the weight of structural truth. He looked toward the cold, distant sun, accepting his final assignment. The game of moral choices was over. The war of materials was irrelevant. The physics of failure, finally, was complete. The laughter had ended. The verdict written in silicon carbide, Inchigo, was clear. Failure. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.